it was mentioned, the topic of the first panel will be, can we afford to lose them? The need to attract top researchers. There's a small abstract of the discussion. Why is it easier for Harvard, Stanford, or Oxford to attract researchers from Austria than the other way around? Our researchers submit excellent research proposals to the ERC. Austria is one of the most successful countries there, and also at the FWF we receive excellent, outstanding proposals. But still, Austria's top research segment is too narrow. What is this? What is causing this lack of breadth? Does Austria have too few jobs to offer researchers at reasonable conditions? What roles do factors like tenure-track prospects, the presence of excellent peers, research autonomy, the balance between teaching and research, and the availability of research funding play? And how much exchange goes on between the academic research and the R&D sector in industry? These are the issues we will be discussing. We will start the discussion with a keynote by Robert Dijkgraaf, and then following with a panel discussion and also inviting questions from the audience. So let me introduce and welcome on stage our first keynote speaker, Robert Dijkgraaf. Robert Dijkgraaf is a renowned mathematical physicist and for 10 years was the director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. In 2022, he became the Netherlands Minister of Education, Culture and Science and held this position until summer 2024. Some weeks ago, he was elected to become the future president of the International Science Council. We are very much looking forward to your keynote.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I've got to know Austria as a country that deeply believes in science, and it's a great pleasure to be here, particularly with, I would say, one of my favorite colleagues in European Council meetings. Martin, wonderful to be here, and I think Manuel and I will be here also to demonstrate to you, whatever the future will bring, there is a life after politics. And as was said, this discussion that we have today is perhaps even more timely than we could think. But let me start, because there are a lot of pressing issues, but let me start with the glass half full. No, knowledge and technology are needed more than ever, for science itself, for society, for a modern, innovative knowledge economy. There are tremendous opportunities for science and technology. I think scientists living right now can say, rightfully, that they are living in the most exciting period. Think what happened in quantum technology and biotech and AI in the social sciences. I think we should recognize that science is the most reliable source for optimism. Every day we learn something, we have discovered something more. But it's important for increasing productivity and economic growth for our societies and addressing our societal issues, whether it's energy security, national security, climate change, an aging population, the digital threats. And everything is becoming more and more urgent because we're living in a background of indeed increasing geopolitical tension, isolationist trends, and rapidly accelerating technology. And I was talking to somebody the other day, very senior scientist, who had lived through the coldest part of the Cold War. He said he'd never seen it as bad as it is right now. But there are also tremendous opportunities, and I think that will be the topic today of our discussion. And I think there's a special role for Europe. I think actually talent is our most valuable natural resource. I like to say it's the only resource that grows when you use it and when you share it. And also, modern science is in many ways Europe's gift to the world. It was born in this kind of strange combination of collaboration and competition, of this plurality of views in connecting to the rest of the world, and I think we should cherish this. Now, the question that was already raised is, how are we doing comparatively? You can criticize it, but it's this list of top-cited researchers. And the university that has the highest number is Harvard University. It has to roughly 200, which is the same number as the Netherlands. Now, this could be a depressing thought. But on the other hand, I feel with the 13 research universities in the Netherlands, we are roughly at the same strength as Harvard. Harvard trains roughly 1,700 students a year. Our Dutch 13 universities train 50,000 students a year. So this is an important lesson. We can be competitive, but we should think in terms of smart, distributed networks. And in order to make us more competitive, I want to highlight 2 points. Basically, the top-down and the bottom-up approach. Let me start with top-down. There's one overall, I think, diagnosis of Europe, which is that the whole is less than the sum of the parts. This is true in Europe, and it's unfortunately also true in many of our national policies. I think there's tremendous opportunities to align our strategies and build alliances. I think actually funding instruments should be magnets to stimulate such an alignment of research and innovation policies, of institutions, of member states within the European Union and in the EU as a whole. Because I think we truly should believe in smart specialization. I think too often our institutions are doing the same thing instead of taking complementary roles. In an atmosphere of trust, we should collaborate, specialize, and avoid duplication, but also avoid gaps. Frankly, there's too much of the same happening in research. And taking a little preview of the discussion, I think in the next panel, there can only be 100% of autonomy. So it's impossible that both institutions, individual researchers, institutions, member states can all be totally autonomous. We have to, in some sense, distribute autonomy in a smart way. So I think this would be my first piece of advice. No, we have to find ways to build smart networks in Europe that as a network can actually compete with the rest of the world. And I have this image that just as you have a geological atlas where you have the various maps, that you can look at the map of Europe in particular lights, and that for every topic, some centers will light up. And if you look at the map through another light, so not quantum, but say biotech, then other areas would actually come forward. The second component, I would say, is the bottom-up, and that's basic research. It was already said we need complementary, generous support for basic research, because I think the number one rule to attract talent is that talent attracts talent. And talent is attracted by the freedom to research, the freedom to have curiosity-driven, unrestricted research, only based on excellence. And that means that there is a fundamental question that funding agencies and countries and Europe as a whole has to ask: what is our portfolio that we are supporting? And I think in some sense, we have to discuss what is the risk budget that we want to have. To which extent do we want to have high risk, high return efforts? And I think there's a certain risk here, which, well, there's a certain trap that we support research which is neither freely unrestricted basic research nor really smart strategic research. There's a muddy middle ground, and many people have indicated that science itself seems to become risk adverse. There's like a regression to the mean, and I think this is something that we have to take to heart. Are we able to take kind of upside risk, which, that's one of the wonderful thing if you in science policy, that the outcomes can be better than expected. And crucial element too, to have this competitive infrastructure, I want to mention is large-scale infrastructures. So the big scientific instruments that are a key role to be competitive. They are a magnet, not only for particles, but it can be a magnet for talent, for excellence. In fact, large-scale infrastructure is, I think, one of the success stories of Europe. It's together we're able to afford world-class facilities that are beyond the financial and organizational capacity of individual states. And one of the crucial thing I think we're learning again, that skill in certain parts of science is absolutely crucial. It's, by the way, also important for economic competitiveness. Europe, we often complain about its inertia and complexity, but I would say it's, instead of being a bug, it can also be a feature. The complexity of Europe can also create a stability that allow us to make long-term plans. I think this is something where I see that some of the large-scale infrastructure is able to plan for decades, while it's very difficult to plan for decades within politics. Some sense the averaging out, I would say, of the European politics could be a good thing. A second element is also that if you think of these smart infrastructures, they can be distributed. Now, one of the real challenges for Europe will be if we make the case for science technology that all member states, all regions can benefit. And that not only, so to say, the usual suspects benefit. And this is something, an important lesson, I think particular for countries like Austria, for the Netherlands, what typically do really well, as we just said, in the competitive programs. But we make sure that being successful in science technology is a success story for everyone, for every region, in your country and also in Europe. And I think there are smart ways to distribute also infrastructure so that all benefit. And perhaps the most important thing, the European model can be a growth model. Now, we are living in a world more and more dominated by a few superpowers. But there are many, many other countries that they're looking for a reliable partner. And I think the complicated European model, where actually you can be associated to and can grow, I think is an incredibly important lesson, because we're also living in a time where whole continents, whether it's Latin America, Africa, and Asia, are coming online. There's tremendous opportunities and room for talent. And that talent, if you say, how do we attract talent? It's not only attracting talent back from the US, etc. It's really the talent that's being now being available and accessible all over the world. Well, we probably also at some point will discuss about innovation. I know this discussion today is basically about science, but it's also very important to involve the private domain. And here I think actually I have some worries, because we are living also in a time when some of the top research is moving into the private industry. Now, we see this in AI, we see it in the biotech world, and perhaps also soon in quantum. We also have to see that it's very difficult for the public sector to keep up with these huge infrastructure demands. In the most recent number I could find was 2023, where the top 10 US tech companies spent together 250 billion, just to give an indication. There are AI computing centers being built at a price of 100 billion that roughly demands 2 gigawatt of power, which is like a city of 1 million inhabitants. So that's the kind of scale that we're thinking about. So it's very important, I think, again also to attract the talent, that we have strategic private-public investments so that we can also involve the private sector in this. And I think one of my piece of advice would be, and we'll say a few more words about in a moment, that we also think of hybrid careers and positions. Now, my own experience is that many people love to work in these with these large companies, but they also would love to have one leg, so to say, in the academic world. So from academia, I think we have to be more flexible in allowing these kind of constructions. And finally, I would say, this was all about structure. And I would say what perhaps even more important is culture. I would say is Europe's soft power. We have to recognize that science itself is evolving. This is a wonderful quote by Steven Weinberg that I'm slightly paraphrasing, where he said, in science, we usually learn about nature, but sometimes in science, we learn about science. And I think this is a moment where we have to think about what is our architecture and also what is our culture. I think where technology and science are so rapidly evolving, science itself should also be explorative. And we should, so to say, see where we can think of new life forms in terms of science organizations. It's very important to recognize and reward the various diverse careers that particular young scientists want to explore. No, we should not fall victim to what's called the tyranny of metrics. It's not only citations. There are many, many ways I think we can qualify the value of science, but we should also use many ways to qualify the value of scientists. What does it mean to contribute to the scientific enterprise? We should, I think, eliminate many of the artificial distinctions that are still there in terms of academic staff, supportive staff, research staff, technical staff, etc. And there are many, many groups in society that still don't feel a home. Now, one thing I learned in the whole debate about inclusion and diversity, which in certain parts of the world now is, the thought police will tell you that you can't think about it anymore, is that at some point somebody said to me, stop using the word inclusion. Because inclusion is about, can you find a place within the scientific enterprise? The word to use is expansion. How can science expand so that other groups that currently don't feel there are roles for them in research and technology can actually feel that they are being welcomed? And I think, here it's not only about culture but also about values. Now, I think in the end, which might be the most determining and most forceful selling point for Europe will be its values. I think Europe should believe in an open, collaborative model, open in the sense to society, open to other forms of collaboration, open to other partners, open in terms of access and data, and particularly open in the sense of having no thought police, no censorship, and really stand firmly for academic freedom. And there are two ways to deal with the issue of academic freedom. Now, one is which usually is this distinction between negative and positive freedom. Now, negative freedom is that you are free of fear, that you can think what you want to think, that you can investigate what you want to investigate. And I think we should stand firmly for that. But positive freedom is that you also are able to pursue those reasons. And that means that there is funding, that there is infrastructure to actually support into this. I think actually the values of science are crucial. I think many of the values of science are values that should also be values of our society. It's respect for facts, it's respect for the uncertainty, respect for the fact that you know that you don't know something, and the respect for the effort of science, which is the wonder of the world and the human beings. And I think those values in the end will be absolutely crucial to have a productive and fertile and optimistic environment where scientists feel both welcome and supported. Thank you very much.
We have somewhere here. Yeah, thank you for this keynote, which clearly prepared the ground for an interesting discussion. And now it's my pleasure to welcome the other members of the panel here on stage. So let me introduce them to you. Martin Hetzer. He has been the president of the Institute of Science and Technology Austria, ISTA, since January 2023, where he also heads a research group as professor of molecular and cell biology. Before returning to Austria, he conducted research for over 20 years at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in Loyola, California, where he also served as senior vice president and chief science officer. Welcome on stage. Henrike Hartmann studied pharmaceutical sciences at the University of Freiburg and did her doctorate in pharmacology in Heidelberg and Mannheim. She spent 3 years as researcher at the Harvard Medical School in Boston and at the University of Frankfurt am Main. She has been working for the Volkswagen Foundation since 1998. Since 1921, she is Deputy Secretary General of the Volkswagen Foundation. It's a pleasure to have you here. Stephanie Ellis did her undergraduate studies in cell biology and genetics, as well as her PhD in cell and developmental biology at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. From 2014 to 2022, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Laboratory of Mammalian Cell Biology and Development at the Rockefeller University in New York. In 2023, I'm proud to say that she received an FWF Start Award, and she came back to Austria as a new group leader at the Max Perutz Labs at the University of Vienna. Welcome on stage. And finally, I would like to invite to come up Sabine Herrlichka. She has been the CEO of Infineon Technologies Austria since 2014. After studying at the BOKU Vienna, she began her professional career as a postdoctoral researcher. She held positions at the US National Science Foundation and the Johns Hopkins University, the Medical University of Graz, and the FFG. She became a member of the management board of Infineon Technologies Austria in 2011, and as mentioned, acceded to the position of CEO only 3 years later. Welcome on stage. So, I want to begin with the youngest member of our panel. Why is that so? Because for the FWF, funding early career researchers is very important. With our projects, we fund roughly 5,000 researchers. 3,500 of them are 35 years or younger, so early career researchers. And we want to understand a little bit what motivated you to come back. You had a fantastic international career in Canada and the US. Why did you come back to Austria? So what are we doing right? What could we do better?
Hi. Thanks again for including me in this. This is, I think, a really fun topic. I mean, I think I have to say, when I first was opening my faculty position search from where I was a postdoc in New York, and I started applying in Europe, I often had these sort of like preliminary interactions with people from the panel that were almost suspicious. Like, what is your connection? Why do you want to come back? But I think for me, I mean, first of all, I'm not American, I'm Canadian. And at that point, I mean, this was 5 years ago, I don't know, I didn't really trust the certainty of the climate for research, and looking kind of across the pond to Europe, I sort of, was very attracted by the more collaborative attitude to funding, to even the way people engage in scientific discussions. So I don't know, I think I had no vision of coming to Europe in the first place, but I think I was very open-ended with the way that I approached my search. I think the other key thing is that I do have personal connections to Europe, and I think for a lot of people in the US and even in Canada, there isn't even a consideration to come without these initial connections. So this for me was part of the process.
Maybe can I repeat the second part of my question? What can we do better?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the really key concrete things is I wouldn't have come if I was not offered a tenure-track position. And I mean, this already came up a little bit in the introduction. These positions are relatively rare, but I think without sort of a secure path towards a stable future in a research career, it just is untenable to think about applying to something that doesn't have that stability. And so I think my institute at the University of Vienna that I'm part of, the director there, I think did a really good job of putting together this very competitive package that I think we need more of this to get people like me to have Austria on the radar.
Okay, thank you very much for this opening statement. Maybe let me continue with Sabine Herrlichka. You're head of a company who has 6,000 employees in Austria, and around 2,500 of them are in R&D, making Infineon Austria's strongest research company. So you're clearly an important employer for many people who did academic training in Austria. It was mentioned also by Robert Dijkgraaf, top researchers, top talent goes to industry. What is your experience with that? And I keep always wondering, why don't they come back to academia? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks so much. What's even more interesting, in addition to 2,500 people in R&D out of 6,000 employees, is that we are a fairly international company. We have people, and this is the majority of the R&D people, from 80 different nations, 80. They come from all different areas, but of course we are in the sector of microelectronics. We have actually started off some 50 years ago as an extended workbench. And today we are a leader in microelectronics applications, partly market leader in some of the applications like security, like energy efficiency. Now, how do we get the best and brightest to Austria? And it's not even Austria. Some of you might be aware of where our Austrian headquarters is. That's in Villach. Yeah. And when I started at Infineon Austria, the most common question was, how do you get people to not just Austria, Villach? People from 80 different countries, top leaders, like for instance, as mentioned, microelectronics, energy, power electronics, quantum technologies, ion traps, for instance. Well, it's always the excitement on the topic of the job, top-level jobs, the opportunity to work in an international environment, and the question you came up with, the exchange in an active ecosystem. And an active ecosystem consists of academia, universities of applied sciences, small companies as well as large ones. And this is one of my favorite topics, and I'm very much in favor, and we are fostering a lot of exchange in this respect, that we strengthen the exchange, the multi-dimensional exchange between academia and companies, industry, small and large companies. I mean, it's fairly typical for people to go from academia to a company, but the other way around. And I think this is one of the very clear differences also to other strong economic areas. How do we foster this exchange? For instance, with our PhD program, we have a network of some roughly 100 PhDs. And these are PhDs who work with us, but who also work at the universities, and we foster this kind of exchange. And of course, it's not just done when they finish their PhD. We stay in contact with them and further continue working with them, either when they stay at Infineon, get a job at Infineon, or whenever they are placed and moved to another university in Austria or beyond.
Thank you very much. I was cooking up a follow-up question, but I'll ask you that later. Let me continue. Maybe I continue with Henrike Hartmann. So you're working for the Volkswagen Foundation, which has less restrictions than, say, the FWF. You're a private foundation, you're completely independent to set your agenda. You can fund not only in Germany, but all over the world. So you have a different perspective on funding. What are the elements that work? What is particularly important to attract talent, Do you have interesting examples from other countries where you're active, which you could share with us?
Well, first of all, I think it's a difficult question because I have the feeling there's so much said about it already, just not by everybody, because I think a lot of those issues are really known. And indeed, it's true we can fund internationally, but I think also as a private foundation, we just also face the same problems and the same issues. So I think if you want to be successful and attract talent, first of all, it is always the intellectual enriching environment. And as my neighbor already said, I think in many cases it's just this one single individual which is really attracting other people. So excellence attracts excellence, and if you find a way to kind of get such a person started and then develop a hub around that with opportunity, with exchange, that's just one of the best ways actually to get things started. And I think we can talk about that a lot. And there is a lot of good examples around already. So I think we should learn from each other. Like I was just last week, I was at the MIT. If you see what's going on there, of course, that's a specific example, but also in Munich, let's put it that way. So there's a lot of places where these things actually work. So I think it's good to look there, learn from them, talk to them. But of course, I think one point is also we always talk about money, sufficient resources. So you need some kind of basic funding to run your lab. If you have to start in the first place to get the basic funding for your lab, that is just not attractive. And as was mentioned also previously, I think it's good to find new ways of research funding so that not every funder does the same thing. And there indeed it's true, as a private funder you can experiment much more. So we introduced, let's say, kind of a lottery in our research funding to fund more high-risk stuff. Or what we do is distributed peer review to also find new ways to fund people who don't want to decide if they have to be in academia or outside academia, but fund people who really make the decision, I want to be in both worlds. So I think maybe it also needs some new formats to support these kind of new developments and be attractive for the really innovators. I think that's important as well. And if we talk about resources, it's also about infrastructure, of course, obviously large infrastructure, but I also think small infrastructures. We need better ways to jointly use infrastructures and instruments, which, by the way, also helps to make research much more sustainable. So I think there's new ways, and resources is also about staff. Now, if you want to go someplace and there's no PhD students, there's no staff around you can recruit, this is not very attractive. So you have to think about what is a good environment for that and what kind of teaching do need these students, like talking about entrepreneurial, educational entrepreneurship, something like that. And I think that also makes the place very attractive. And of course, if you talk about international researchers, what we see is that for some of them, it's really difficult to come to the European system. It takes forever to get a visa and permit, and that should be something which is rather in weeks than in months. And if you want them to stay, you need just to become much more flexible, particularly in times like that, where we really want them to come and where we really want them to stay. And I think if we think about staying, it's also about not only integrating them into the academic system, but also integrate them in our society. And I think that's a responsibility of the institutions as well, because in many cases what we see is people come, like it, and leave because they never really arrived in a society. And I think this is something we really have to face. And I mean, attractive salary, of course. I mean, if you want people who want to go to the academia and have a much higher salary in industry, whatever, you have to find ways to become more flexible with that. And what we also see, and I'm always amazed by that, how much time is wasted for researchers for administrative tasks and bureaucracy. I mean, we cannot afford that to happen, that researchers waste so much time for documentation and things like that, and so they cannot use their valuable time to actually do their research. And of course, finally, I think actually really in these times, we need to look at the advantage we have in Europe, and we have to work on that, look for a diverse research community. And I think as funders, we also have the responsibility to support that, because I think that's just the way to go, and that's a huge opportunity for Europe. And I think we have to really get our things together join forces and make sure we have a competitive and attractive research system. And I'm quite sure then we will be really attractive and people come and people will stay. But we have to be flexible. Yeah, that's what I think.
Good, then let me continue with a place which, judging from the numbers of applications they get, must be very attractive, namely the Easter. And in my opening statement, I mentioned this picture of the Institute coffee machine where there's a low-level exchange of ideas. So you interact with a group of peers. So Martin, how many coffee machines do you order every week? And are there other secrets at Easter?
Okay, well, thank you for that great question, especially for Viennese, obviously. And thanks you actually for telling me that you're going to ask me the question, because I asked, I checked in, and I know the number. We have up to 50 coffee machines.
50.
50. Now, why do you ask that? It's obviously, so we are a new institute, fairly, founded really in 2009, but really in the 2010s. And so we're still a young institute. And so we are, unlike our main competitors, which we see in the US, in other parts in Europe, we are decidedly oriented towards international science. So we actually have 79 different nationalities. We want to provide an environment for scientists from all over the world. And so a key question that I ask myself every day, how can we be competitive? And how can we be competitive with places like Oxford, ETH, MIT, and you name it? And the answer in my mind to that is that we have to differentiate ourselves. We have to offer something that is either not possible or much more difficult for those big brand names in science to do. And I think one key aspect, and that relates to the coffee machines, and you pointed to that, you used this artificial barriers or ideas. I strongly believe that those barriers that we artificially create between basic science, applied science, between different disciplines, are actually not aligned with many scientific endeavors. And actually, in some cases, can even hold back progress. And I know from my time in the US, even some of the most well-known places like Harvard can actually not support the scientists in specific departments as soon as they dare to venture into a different direction. And that's hard to believe, but that's actually in many cases the reality. And I think especially in Europe, we also need, and you talked about complementarity, so we try to offer something that other places just have a harder time to offer. And that is to create a space where scientists from anywhere can come, pursue their questions without or as little barriers as possible. And so those coffee machines are just one symbol. They're scattered around the institute at strategic places, or gathering places, where people are encouraged to come out of their buildings, out of their laboratories, out of their groups to exchange ideas. And so coffee machines are not our secret sauce, so don't get, so we try to have this consistently throughout, from the architecture, through the organization, through the processes. So I give you a few examples. We have a graduate school, currently about 470 PhD students, so we're not a university, we don't have undergraduates, but we imported a process from the US. And that is, we have a general admission of all PhD students. And before they can actually pick a lab for their PhD, they actually have to rotate between different labs. And that turns out to be a wonderful tool for young students who come in with a certain idea, or that's what they would like to do. But then they rotate in a group and are exposed to questions, methods that they haven't even known about. And so they either then change their directions or start to collaborate between two labs. So it's another measure to foster this interaction between different groups. And so we strictly, this actually was my New Year's resolution and I only had one. And so far, I'm successful. I try not to use, whenever we talk about the Institute of Science and Technology internally, not to use any discipline. is to really always approach it from what research really does. Because I think we all agree, or in many cases agree, there are many questions that cannot be addressed within a discipline. And I think that's sort of part of our philosophy. And I think I would like to really focus, is that to be a place for young scientists and also senior scientists who still are young at heart, to really embrace that. And I think a key feature for us is that also distinguishes us from other institutions in Europe, and we can do that, is a really tenure track. So people can actually start here, start their group, and also if they go through this rigid selection process, which we call tenure, they can move from assistant to professor and then stay there. They don't have to leave. And so I think we can offer a mixture, a hybrid between tested and successful methods from Europe, which includes, for instance, really long-term planning. I think something in California I learned, there things are started very easily, but there's often not a very long-term planning. And then also import elements that have been shown to work successfully internationally. So the coffee machines are just one symbolizing that we also, I think you referred to that in your presentation, we also try to pioneer the way science is being done, because that is dramatically changing. I would argue it's always changed, it's always, but the speed by which it's changing, it's clearly accelerated, or at least it feels to me, although I'm getting older, so maybe it's just, that explanation. But I think, we want to remain agile and want to be able to adapt to changing environments. And also want to refer to Infinium, because you brought this up as an ecosystem. I mean, it's a word we often use, but also because we don't believe in these artificial barriers, we create in a campus in Klosterneuburg, where we really go from the discovery that we often see in basic research, but that's also not always true, because there can be discoveries in other areas as well, all the way to startups and even venture funds or venture capital. So we really try to create this whole ecosystem to support especially young scientists, really explores the diversity and the rapidly changing landscape in science.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing your ideas from the ISTA, which is clearly a place different from universities, other research institutions in Austria. Still, I think some of the ideas, some of the concepts you are developing are interesting also for other institutions such as universities. Robert Dijkgraaf, you've been leading a place that is maybe even more special, the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. We discussed a little bit over lunch, a very peculiar place, very different from universities, but very successful in attracting talent. Even so, this place is so different from other research institutions. Are there lessons which you think can be transferred to universities, to other research institutions, in particular also in the European setting?
Yes, I think there can be. So one thing which I do like about the US system is that it has a huge biodiversity. And one thing we have seen is that researchers, if you attract research, I always say that in research, social Darwinism works, right? So you want to be at a place where people are successful and you become successful too. But beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and scientific productive environment is in the eye of the beholder. So we need to have very different environments where people can flourish. And that's, I think, we should also encourage, whether it's universities or research institutes or nations or funders, to experiment and find new forms. Because as you said, science is developing rapidly, almost at an unprecedented rate, and I think our architecture is not really following this. So I think actually Europe now has tremendous. I think there's a real window of opportunity. We should also realize that you want to be you want to be productive as a scientist, so you want to go to a place that is supportive, but you also want to be part of a successful and productive community. And I feel here, I think there's a great advantage now for Europe also to get its acts together. So I think, it's not only important that you can join this research institute or that university, but that you feel you're actually part of this European community. And I think, any efforts that will be made right now, it's incredibly important that this is done, in a collective way. One thing I felt, I was very proud to do as a minister in the Netherlands, I had the opportunity to really have a serious investment in the research infrastructure. But what I asked our research universities to come with one plan where they, collectively decided who was going to do what. That was a kind of painful process. But the important part is that if you then join that community, you feel you're not just joining that one university, but you're actually joining a much larger community. And I would love to see something like that at the European level. And I think actually there is really an opportunity now, I think, for Europe to step up. Say, well, talent from around the world is welcome. And we have all these different, environments, and just, find a place that suits you. But know that you're part of this European community, and you have all your colleagues. And we actually facilitate collaborations and exchange within that community. And I think actually that will be a wonderful advantage.
Since you were bringing up this issue of mobility of researchers within Europe, this was exactly one of the other questions which I prepared for Henrike Hartmann. Since you're active in several countries, do you see the need for more mobility, and can you support this with your funding structures?
We can certainly support that. And on the one side, I do see the need for constant mobility. On the other side, I see that there is a significant decrease in the willingness to be mobile. It's also something we see at the DFG level, that for instances, the application for postdocs, this general thing, I go 2 years to the US or something, the application rate went down on 50%. So the question is, why is that happening? So I think mobility is really important because it really, to have this other research atmosphere around, have other people, that's a really, really valuable experience. And at the same time, work-life balance and other issues really hamper this issue about being mobile. So I think we have to find new creative ways which kind of can provide that mobility without all the negative aspects it has. It's also an issue in terms of women scientists, I think. And it's just also to acknowledge that women have sometimes other needs than men. One is not better than the other, but you have to consider that. But I think mobility is particularly important, as even though I completely agree that it's wonderful to be part and feel identified with this European community, you need this direct personal exchange. You have to feel this community, and you have to some extent be there. So finding ways how you can have something like short-term stays or something like that, I think that's kind of the way to go.
Thank you very much. Maybe I interrupt our discussions for a minute. In maybe 5 minutes or so, I would like to invite also questions from the audience. So if you were stimulated by what we discussed here, prepare your question. 2 or 3 questions I think we can admit. But I would like to come back to another issue which was also raised in the keynote we had from Robert Dijkgraaf. Namely, the freedom of research was an aspect which you mentioned a little bit. And this is actually the question I was preparing for Sabine Herrlichka while you were talking. I think boundary conditions are clearly excellent when working in Infineon. But there's one aspect which interests me. If you work in industry as a researcher, you have less freedom to set your research agenda. When you work at a university, you have a new direction that interests you, you go there, you do research in this direction. How do you cope with this desire to set your own agenda in an industry environment where there's clearly goals to be met, certain developments to be achieved?
Well, first of all, I think it's not necessarily a contradiction. Second, people also like to contribute achieving goals. The question is, what is the goal? So, for instance, if you want to go ahead and develop the most energy-efficient solution, people of different disciplines get together. So, and of course, in an industry setting, you are then doing research planning. Yeah? So road mapping and processes that also relate to market conditions, but at the same time take AI and take a look and consider how fast the development of AI is. So for instance, we are providing solutions, we call it powering AI. So this market develops so rapidly. This has an impact on the research activity going on. So what I want to say is, yes, there are goals. Many people, many of the researchers want to contribute to those. Then we deal with specific market conditions that are not necessarily long-term. And the third element, what we have set up at Infineon is kind of internal venture capital. So on an annual basis, we call it Innovation Accelerator. We provide a certain amount of money. People need to apply. This is an internal training for doing applications, pitching. And the best then are going to be selected and have this kind of venture capital for a year with the target to do some feasibility studies, explore some new fields that are beyond or next to roadmap topics. And the goal then is, after this 1 year, to come up with solutions that might be suitable, then to follow up in this kind of application or, well, excellence-driven context as well.
Very interesting. I wasn't aware of this mechanism. What's the size of this pot?
Last year, some roughly 10, depends on, we have some strategic topics, but let's say 10, 15 million.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. So, let's look at the audience. Anybody who wants to break the ice and interact a little bit with the panel? We have a microphone. Stefan is ready. And I see one hand raised over there and also in the back.
Thank you very much. I think all of what you said is smart. However, in the end, most scientists that I know that have left Austria and never returned, many of them went to industry or founded their companies. They left due to the administrative efforts that are required. And I think this is something you must not overlook. Administration, academia in Austria, but also in other European countries, is probably one of the biggest hurdles and does not require a lot of funding to get rid of it.
This is clearly an issue. I think all of us will have to say something. But from the perspective of a funding organization, we really set a goal to reduce the complexity of our applications. So whenever we set up a new program, we have in mind how complex is the application process, what is the time from application to the final decision, and we really try to work on that. I can't say much about university administration, but anybody else? Maybe Martin, how is the administrative aspect at Easter?
What was the question? I couldn't hear it, the audio was so bad.
The acoustics is very bad, and I was told, since this was the counter hall of the Imperial Postal Saving Banks, it was meant like that, because if people talk about their money, they don't want to be heard. So, not sure this is true. As far as I understood the question is that administration is a big burden for researchers at universities. And I was wondering, is this different at ISTA?
Well, the one attraction is, so we're not a university, we're a research institute, and we have a graduate school, so there is obviously teaching involved, but the administrative burden we try to minimize, especially for young scientists, assistant professors. We do have a burden, and that is our recruitment. I mean, there are obviously, we're a growing institution, so the participation of faculty in the recruitment process. Just to give you numbers, we are currently 90 research groups. Last year we received 1,700 applications, and I made I offered filled 7 positions. So to go through those 1,700, whittle them down to 40, that's a huge additional burden that comes with to get additional to the research efforts and research activities. But we try to be very lean on the administrative side and really not overburden scientists. So I think that's part because we don't have a deep hierarchical structure, and so I think I'm probably not the best to answer like big universities. I think that's a whole different challenge, but we're very cognizant of the fact that this is a program. Actually, in fact, we attract many people from big universities because we don't have a lot of administrative work. So that's clearly one advantage we can offer.
Stephanie is nodding enthusiastically.
Yeah,
Please.
I mean, maybe if I can make a follow-up comment. I mean, I think I have a lot of peers around the world, and I think, bureaucracy at universities is not a unique to Austria problem. I think it scales with, especially if you have a big public university, I mean, it's unavoidable. So if we can solve that, I mean, I think that's a bigger issue. I think what is really a challenge that I've encountered in Austria specifically, language notwithstanding, is that it's very opaque. And a lot of times what's written on the page and what is real is different. And if you come from outside the system, it is very challenging to understand, what you're really dealing with. And I think even, right from the beginning for me, like when I first got my sort of tenure-track agreement and my contract, compared to the American counterparts, and I even know I had a colleague at the same time who had an offer in Switzerland, like the American and Swiss contracts are like, this is what you can expect, this is the dollar amount, these are the milestones, whereas in Univin in Austria, it's more hand-wavy and less concrete, which I think, if you understand the system, you can actually, I know now, you can spin this in a good way, but learning the spin is really tough, and I think to attract outside people, getting rid of some of these opacities would be a real boon for recruitment.
Okay.
Maybe I can add to that, because I think it's an issue all over, that we have too much administration, we have too much bureaucracy, and I think it's really a multi-actor problem, because we have so much documentation and we have so much controlling by really different agencies in Germany at least. And I think everybody agrees on the fact that we need less bureaucracy, but how to get a handle on that seems to be really, really difficult. So the Volkswagen Foundation is just starting a program to help to develop strategic, well, we call it in German Experimentierräume, where we will accept applications from universities together with ministries to find ways to become more flexible and solve these kind of problems, at least for a certain space, and then in an ideal world to help to have like good examples where you can relate to and say, look, it works without these kind of huge bureaucracy and documentation issues. So I'm very curious how that will work, but I think definitely there needs to be something changed. It's too much, that's true. And we as a funder, of course, I mean, we are also part of a problem, so just like you said, we're also trying to keep the paperwork as limited as possible.
I was about to challenge you,
Okay,
but please
please
go ahead.
go.
No, you said something interesting. Science is the most reliable source of satisfaction. Listening, optimism, right?
And
Sorry.
satisfaction too. Yeah.
And satisfaction, yeah.
It's very reliable.
But listening to the discussion in the last 2 minutes, I was wondering if this is also the most reliable source of frustration. I hope not.
No.
But you wanted to say something else, sorry.
No. One thing I learned, for instance, that, as I said, these in terms of administration, bureaucracy, it's very important also, if we want to optimize science, that scientists like to do research, etc. So reducing administration doesn't mean reducing support staff. And one thing I learned at Princeton, for instance, that we were very generous in support staff because we felt, very selfishly that we want to squeeze out every minute of research time from our scientists. Mm-hmm. So whether it's arranging visa, whether it's arranging housing, when it's arranging for families something, because life as a researcher is more than just your research, as you said, particularly for women researchers, a lot of other issues come to play. And if you want to be attractive, you not only want to have stable funding, but actually also you want to have an environment where these things are taken care of. And you can do it in a much more productive way to have dedicated support staff. So I think we often feel that overhead, is unnecessary. I think it actually is very necessary. In fact, it's very effective to have professionals do this. And so that everybody, can do what they are best in, and for researchers doing research, for others actually, providing this supportive environment.
Stefan told me we are running out of time. I guess we had a very interesting discussion. I'm sorry, in 15 minutes, less than 15 minutes, we should start the next panel, but we will have time later to discuss in private. I think we covered a lot of topics. I heard interesting ideas. I was very much interested in your venture money for new ideas. I think our stakeholders hopefully profited from this exchange. Still, I don't want to let you go before one last statement. So each of you, one sentence which you want the audience to remember how to keep an institution attractive for researchers. Martin, we start with you.
Wow. Try to differentiate yourself from your main competitors.
Okay.
Provide freedom and provide support.
Think first of all of what the ideal researcher scientist should be, and then think of your own institution as if it was a researcher, and how would you actually evaluate your own institution? Are you creative? Are you adventurous? Are you intellectually honest? That would be my advice.
Stephanie.
Yeah, I think really thinking about it as a community building exercise and trying to attract people as something that will make the sum greater. Plus everything else.
Everything has been said.
Yeah.
No, but underlining what has been said before, and as such, creating this kind of agile ecosystem, moving back and forth, exchange with the excitement on the topics. And I think that's what's fascinating, and we are in a global competition, so we must be better than the others, and we can.
Thank you very much with this very positive note in the end.